Alright, following on from the last video where we talked about the effects of a tariff in a small country, we're going to hone in on the deadweight loss of a tariff. So this is a reproduction of the supply curve from the last video. Just put it down by itself so we could look at the production effect of the tariff, so we can see that in here. We briefly mentioned that at the end of the last video. The production effect is this small triangle here, and then focusing on the demand curve, you can see the consumption effect of the tariff. There's this small gray triangle right here, and we're going to talk about what that means today. And these two together comprise the deadweight loss. I think your book calls this area B. That's a convention I follow as well. And this area is referred to as D in the book. So the deadweight loss of a tariff is the loss to one group that is not gained by another group, and it's sometimes called the net national loss, and its area is B plus D. So what does this really mean? Intuitively, well, we've got our world price here, PW. Remember, this is a small country, so they are price takers on the world market, which means that they can have all the good they want for PW and nothing if they try to get the good for less. T is the size of a specific tariff, and in the last video that was $1. So in a small country, tariffs are passed on in their entirety to the consumers in the small country. So we see a rise in the price from PW to PW plus T, and as a result the domestic industry expands from Q1 to Q2, and you're probably thinking that sounds like a good thing, but from a point of view of national welfare, it's a bad thing. So the Q1 through Q2 are the units of the good that used to be produced by the foreigner, and now they're produced by the domestic industry. And why is that a bad thing? Well, it's because the domestic industry is less efficient than the foreign industry over those units of production, in the sense that they have higher cost. And how do we know that they have higher cost? Well, we simply have to check this blue line here, which is the world supply, and compare it to the domestic supply curve, and you can see that up to Q1 the domestic supplier is the best source of this good, because the red domestic supply curve lies under the blue world supply curve. But for units Q1 through Q2, you can see that the red curve has cut through the blue curve and now lies above it. And this is a marginal cost curve, if you remember. So actually, if you integrate under a supply curve, you can find total cost. So the production effect is actually simply the size of the discrepancy between the costs associated with producing these units from Q1 up to Q2 in the domestic industry instead of getting them from the foreign supplier who's cheaper. So it's the cost discrepancy. So that's a type of efficiency I think we all understand, and engineers understand. So the production effect is the inefficiency, because these are inefficiencies associated with switching more units to the higher cost domestic industry. It's not that they are terrible at all units. They were fine as the source of the first Q1 units, but they are a less good source of the units from Q1 out to U2. And the consumption effect is a type of inefficiency that I think is less familiar to people, but it's also very important, and it relates to the fact that in general in economics we would like people or consumers to get all goods that they are willing to pay the marginal cost of producing. So the domestic industry the domestic consumer has a demand curve, and you can think of the demand curve as a willingness to pay curve. It's a good sort of alternate name for the demand curve. And the units that go from Q3 to Q4 In the absence of a tariff, the consumer is able to access Q4 units of the good, which is a good thing because our willingness to pay or demand curve shows us that they value these units more highly than they cost to produce. And we know how much they cost to produce because we can check along the blue world supply curve. But when the tariff is put into effect, the price rises and the consumer cuts back to Q3, and we now have a situation where we have units of the good from Q3 out to Q4 that the consumer would have willingly paid for, which we can tell from the demand curve, and the foreign supplier would have willingly supplied. The consumer could have covered the marginal cost, and yet these units of the good are not produced for the consumer. So that's a different type of inefficiency. So that's the inefficiency associated with stopping the consumer from preventing the consumer from buying units of the good that they're willing to cover the cost of. So that the consumer is not able to get units of the good that they value more than they cost to produce. So that's a different type of inefficiency. We know what they cost to produce because we can just check the world supply curve. We know how much consumers value them because we can check the demand curve, and so we can see that it's a failure on the part of the market to provide the units from Q3 out to Q4, and it's also another source of inefficiency that the domestic industry has stepped up production from Q1 to Q2. So both of these combine to give us the deadweight loss of a tariff.